Now, in this filmmaking thing, you only have two choices. You can go with full frame, or you could stick with the Super 35 crop sensor. Now, in today's video, we're going to be talking about the Sony FX3 versus the Sony FX30, and what things might be the same and what things might be different. Now, traditional wisdom might just tell you that full frame is going to be the end-all be-all, and it's going to blow the Sony FX30 right out of the water. However, there are some advantages to actually keeping a Super 35 camera versus something that's full frame. Let's talk about it. Now, we are going to be talking about specifically the FX3 versus the FX30. And from a body perspective, from a design perspective, these cameras are almost indistinguishable. The only two things I could really think of is that on the FX3, there's a little flash button where the light is. And on the other side, the quarter 20 mount screws on the FX30 are black instead of silver. Also, in my hands, this is like marginally lighter than this guy is. And I could tell like a little bit, but honestly, that's not a big deal, especially if you're shooting handheld footage. Now, because these two bodies are also very similar as well, you're also going to have very similar rigging options. In fact, all of the rig videos that I have for the Sony FX30 are interchangeable with the Sony FX3 and vice versa. So if you're wondering if your FX30 accessories are going to work with the Sony FX3, they're going to be interchangeable. It's going to be just fine. Also, both cameras have more or less the same menu system now. There was a recent firmware update that's going to give a lot of the things on the Sony FX30 that the Sony FX3 now has. Things like focus breathing compensation, the quick menu that's going to be there as well, and the anamorphic D-squeeze and the ability to shoot in 4K DCI. Now, where things start to get a little bit different is going to be the shooting modes between the FX30 and the Sony FX3. Now, both are going to be able to shoot in 4K 10-bit at 24 frames a second. They're also going to get 4K 60 and 4K 120 as well. Now, we are going to talk about sensor differences in a little bit, but the Sony FX30 is going to have that at an APS-C type crop, and an even further crop at 4K 120 frames a second. Both are also still going to be able to do HD at 240 frames a second, but you have to consider that crop as well, which might not give you the most detailed and sharp image in the world. However, if you are shooting an APS-C, it's still going to be pretty good for a lot of the normal shooting modes you might have. Now, both cameras are using S-Log3, and with the 10-bit and the dynamic range that comes with it, even though the Sony FX30 does have one stop less of dynamic range than the Sony FX3, they're actually still pretty comparable to each other. In fact, I do use my Sony FX30 to match on my Sony FX6, and I haven't had too many problems. Reason being is because a lot of times I'm going to have my own lighting scenario as well, so I'm going to be exposing for my highlights, I'm going to bring in my light, and go through all of the things that you would on a normal production set when you have access to different lighting equipment. Now, where one thing is going to differ and the Sony FX3 is going to pull away with that full frame sensor is going to be the dual base ISO that's on either one of these cameras. Now, the Sony FX3 does have the ability to use 12,800 as its base ISO, where the Sony FX30 only has the ability to use 2,500. Now, I actually did do a longer version, a longer take on the low light capabilities between these two cameras, and you can check that out right over here. But generally speaking, what's going to end up happening is that with a higher base ISO in the Sony FX3 and that full frame sensor, the Sony FX3 is going to perform better at low light. Now, because of my own personal circumstance and having the Sony FX6 and other cameras that I use for my mainline work, I have actually used these cameras in drastically different situations. Now, for the Sony FX3, I actually had as my A camera before the Sony FX6, and it took the majority of the work that I was doing. I was shooting things like event recapture, different content for different channels, I was shooting stuff for my own channel, vertical content. It was able to do a lot of things at the same time because it had a similar sensor to something like the Sony FX6, but it also had that compactness so I could rig it up however I wanted to, and it was really versatile for those situations. Now, I did upgrade to the Sony FX6, and that's taking the majority of my A camera work, but the Sony FX30 was not only a B camera, but now it's something that I use for vertical content, event capture, and a lot of smaller form stuff. However, a lot of people on the flip side are gonna go and say full frame is everything, and the Sony FX3 as a concept is way better than the Sony FX30, and I don't think that could be farther from the truth. Now, keep in mind, the Sony FX30 is almost like half the price of the Sony FX3, so if we're gonna go from value to your dollar, the Sony FX30 should only be half as good as the full frame Sony FX3, which you're going to learn after today isn't necessarily the case. Now, with full frame sensors, you're going to realize you're going to have better depth of field and you're going to have better low light, and overall the image quality is going to look a little bit better than the Sony FX30 or Super 35 sensor in general. However, Super 35 is not only still part of the standard that you're going to see in production between cameras like the C70, the Red Komodo, the Ursa 12K, there's a ton of different cinema cameras that are still Super 35 that produce amazing images. But here are some reasons why you might want to go with the crop sensor Super 35 versus something that might be full frame. frame. Now, first off, the Sony FX30 is straight up half as much as the Sony FX3. Now, if you want to get it without the top handle, you could pick up the Sony FX30 for $17.99, where the Sony FX3 is about $2,000 more. And to be honest, I don't necessarily think of the Sony FX30 as half as good. Now, there is going to be a discrepancy between these sensors. There's a full frame sensor on the FX3 and the crop sensor on the Sony FX30. But that just means that I could use more lenses on a Super 35 sensor versus something that's full frame. For example, I could use my 13mm Viltrox lens that I have for my Sony FX3, which is great for vlogging and generally just a great wide lens. On the flip side, I can't use that same lens on a full frame sensor or I'm going to get vignetting, which is going to be a dark circle around your image while using APS-C lenses on full frame cameras. But I could also take out something like my 20mm G lens and I could use it on my Sony FX30 just fine. In fact, I do have a full video on that and you can check it out right over here because I do review what full frame lenses work like on APS-C type cameras. The cool thing about lenses as well with using APS-C type sensors is that they're overall going to be cheaper. If I'm going to buy an APS-C version of a lens, if there's a full frame counterpart for it, it's actually going to be a little bit more expensive. For example, I do have this 50mm anamorphic lens by Sony, and this lens is going to cost close to about $2,000. However, if I was going to get the APS-C version of that, although it's going to have different optical qualities, it's actually going to be significantly cheaper. And with that 1.5 times crop that's going to be on your lenses anyways, you're going to get similar optics in terms of the field of view, but it's going to be cropped down to a Super 35 format. Next is if I'm going to have that sensor crop, I may as well just make the crop work for me. And what I mean by that is that the Sony FX30 does have a 1.5 times crop, which also means if I'm in a situation where I need a little bit more reach out of my lens and I just don't have a telephoto lens on me, I am going to get a 1.5 times crop while using the Sony FX30. Now, if I want to make sure that I have the best detail and the best image quality possible, I'm going to try to shoot at my base ISO at 800 to give me the best dynamic range and reduce the amount of noise that might come into my image. So 50mm turn into more 75mm lenses, 16s become 24s, so on and so forth. You have to do a 1.5 times calculation to find out what your field of view is going to look like, but overall you're going to get more reach if you're using a Super 35 sensor, which might be an advantage for a lot of people, especially if you're shooting sports or wildlife, or you just don't like being super close to your subjects. Now, one of the big arguments is going to be the low light performance, and on top of that, the depth of field that comes with full frame sensors. And that's something that I just can't deny. If you're using a full frame sensor, you're going to get a better depth of field than using something at Super 35. However, if you think about this on the flip side, that means with less depth of field, it's going to be easier to manual focus. Think about it. If there's more bokeh in the background, it's easier to get that blurry background, then it's actually going to be harder to actually manual focus when you're using lower f-stops or lower t-stops. When I'm using Super 35, at least in my experience from having Super 35 cameras, I did find it a little bit easier to pull my focus manually because a lot of things wouldn't be out of focus. So as somebody that does shoot on handheld, I do shoot a lot of moving objects and a lot of moving subjects. Using something that's Super 35 while leveraging the lack of depth of field actually might make it easier if I'm pulling manual focus. Now, if you're using autofocus lenses, it doesn't necessarily mean that much, but if I am someone that's going more on the manual side with cinema lenses, using Super 35 actually might be an advantage. Now, speaking specifically of the Sony FX3 versus the Sony FX30, functionally there's not a gigantic difference between the two. After that firmware update, there's no longer a gigantic difference in terms of the menu settings or the different features that are available on either camera. Now, I will say that the 4K 120 frames on the Sony FX30 kind of sucks. So you need a lot of light, it's very noisy, and it does make a further crop. But outside of that, realistically, the functionality from a menu settings and a customization standpoint, they're honestly almost the same camera. I can still load in LUTs, I'm still going to get S-Log3 and S-Cinetone, the card slots are the same, I'm still going to be able to use a special cable for timecode, I could actually still export 16-bit RAW via a recorder, and it actually does have a lot of similar features. It's just that one thing at the front of the camera that might crop in your image or one thing that leaves it full frame. And above all else, especially if you're working in video production or as a filmmaker, between the Sony FX30 and the Sony FX3, when you bring it on set, no one's going to be able to tell the difference. The cameras are virtually indistinguishable. There's a couple of different colors of certain things. You're going to rig it up the same way. You're going to add the same accessories. Maybe you'll change a lens or two to accommodate for the crop, but when it comes to client perception between these two cameras specifically, they almost look exactly the same. So I don't think anybody's going to care if you're using the Sony FX3 versus the Sony FX30. Now, that all to be said, I'm going to be fair. There might be some things that you might not want to buy the Sony FX30, and the FX3 makes a lot more sense. But this is actually a much shorter list just in a much shorter part of the video. Now, the first thing is going to be that you need that low light performance. Now, the Sony FX3 does have 12,800 as its second base ISO, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's going to be worse than using 2500 on the Sony FX30 with a smaller sensor. With a bigger sensor, you're going to get the ability to get more light, and on the Sony FX3, you're going to be able to do that. You're going to have better low light performance in something that's APS-C, so it makes sense. If you want to go for low light, go with a full frame camera. Number two is that you already have a full array of full frame glass. If you already have a bunch of full frame glass, then maybe the Sony FX30 doesn't make a lot of sense to you, especially if you need something on the wider range. That means you have to buy an extra lens, and you don't want to do that. If you want to keep everything the same and maybe you're upgrading from another full frame camera, then just keeping it in the same family and getting a similar field of view like the FX3 makes a lot more sense. Now that leads into my last point between the Sony FX3 and the Sony FX30. Now, a big reason why some people want to buy the 3 over the 30 is because money isn't a big obstacle. Some people are actually working in professional video production where they are getting some of those budgets that can accommodate for a more expensive camera that's going to give them a little bit more than something like the Sony FX30. My personal opinion is that if you're someone starting off in cinematography, the Sony FX30 punches way above its weight class because even though it's half the price, I don't think it's half the functionality as the FX3 itself. Now, for somebody from the Moneybags family, don't let me sit here and try to tell you otherwise. If you need the full frame sensor, you need the bigger features, you need the better low light and the depth of field, then getting the Sony FX3 is going to make a lot more sense than the 30. But if you're somebody that's just starting out and you don't necessarily have the biggest budget in the world, well, I've been able to have a lot of functionality and get a lot of good quality images coming out of this guy. That being said, that's a comparison between the Sony FX30 and the Sony FX3. Now, both of these are great and amazing cameras, and at the end of the day, these are just tools. And picking the one that you need is going to be effective to make sure that you're getting the images that you want and you're making the money that you want to out of your video production journey. That being said, let me know what camera that you use, or if you're team Sony FX30 or your team Sony FX3. That being said, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.